and welcome to the special World Oceans Week with 8X Pixel Virtual Expo. And today here we do have Alice Grainger. She is the Communications Director for Coral Restoration Foundation, and also used to be the Senior Editor of Asian Diver and Scuba Diver Australasia, but that is history at the moment, as Alice embarked into her new challenges in saving, the saving corals, basically, I think. And so for this special Coral Triangle Day, she'll be sharing with us her stories and also her experiences as she dive into the biggest coral restoration efforts in the world. And without further ado, let me just introduce Alice. Alice, please take over. Thank you.
Nora, thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And it's really wonderful to be back here, part of an Underwater 360 event. So thank you to the whole team, and thank you, John, for inviting me to be part of it. It's highly technical. I need to warn everybody before we start, it's past the bedtime for my cat and he's got a lot of opinions. So we might have some opinions meowing going on in the background. So apologies in advance if we get interrupted. Okay, I'm going to go ahead and launch these pictures. So, as Nora told you, I am now working as the Communications Director for Coral Restoration Foundation. It's a nonprofit based in Florida, and I'm really excited to be here to share this super cool mission with all of you today. So let's just talk a little bit about corals. I mean, most of you watching here, you'll be familiar with these amazing ecosystems for their intrinsic beauty and playgrounds that we all love to dive on and explore. Corals have actually been around for more than 500 million years, which is extraordinary when you think that the dinosaurs went extinct around 65 million years ago. So coral reefs have been around 7 times longer than the dinosaurs have been extinct. They're one of the oldest and most biodiverse ecosystems on the planet. They also create this really complex habitat that's actually contributed to speciation in the ocean. And have created the most diverse ecosystems that we have in the world. Alfie agrees. I don't know if you can hear. But in the past 30 years, we've seen a lot of changes in the underwater world. And unfortunately, a lot of the coral reefs that were once flourishing areas of natural beauty now look like this, essentially a coral graveyard. Coral reefs are actually one of the most threatened habitats on Earth, and stony corals, specifically those are the reef-building corals, are some of the most at-risk groups of animals in the world now facing extinction. So other than being beautiful, coral reefs are also really important. They provide a lot of ecosystem services, as most of you will know. At least 500 million people rely on them for food and coastal protection. Their economic value is estimated to be around $10 trillion globally. These are the rainforests of the sea. They're hotspots of life-sustaining biodiversity. But we're now looking at the possibility of a world without coral reefs. We've already lost 50% of the world's corals in the last 30 years. And in the next 80 years, all shallow water coral reefs could become extinct, which is a terrifying thought, especially for those of us who have a really emotional connection with these environments. So let's talk a little bit about Florida. So many people know about the Great Barrier Reef. A lot of people know about Belize, the reef in Belize, which is the 2nd largest barrier reef in the world. But the 3rd largest barrier reef is actually here in Florida. It's the only barrier reef in the United States. It's 360 miles long. And it used to be one of the most beautiful underwater environments on the planet. This reef is critical, especially here in Florida. We have hurricanes coming through all the time. A healthy coral reef will actually dissipate around 97% of wave energy before it reaches the shore. So the barrier reef here is critical to protecting infrastructure during high energy storm events. It's also obviously a habitat for fish. And down here in the Florida Keys, where I'm living right now, you know, everybody's livelihoods are tied to this reef in some form or another. You know, it is the reason that people come down here. But now, unfortunately, the reef looks like this. The level of die-off that we're seeing in the Great Barrier Reef now actually started happening here in Florida in the 1970s. This is a picture of Carey's Fort Reef, which is an iconic dive site in the US. This is an iconic image, the lighthouse at Carey's Fort, but you can see that what should be fields and fields of elkhorn and staghorn coral is coral rubble. So let's look a little bit more closely. Let's go back in time and look at what Carey's Fort used to look like. So this is Carey's Fort in 1975. This picture was taken by Phil Dustin, who's a professor of coral biology and ecology. You can see here these incredible fields of elkhorn coral. You can see the fish living in them. These stands of coral are about 3 to 5 feet high. Back in the, you know, in the 70s and earlier, you would see these fields would stretch for miles and miles and miles and miles. This was the dominant, you know, seascape of the Florida Keys. Just 10 years later, 1985, and we can see that Carey's Fort is already looking very, very different. Fast forward to 2004, and you can see that the reef is now essentially dead limestone skeleton, and then 2014, its skeleton covered with macroalgae, and the algae will outcompete the coral every time. So there's no place on this reef for corals to settle or grow. This reef is essentially functionally extinct. In the Florida Keys, in the last 40 years, we've lost 97% of the once dominant reef building coral species, the staghorn and the elkhorn. In many places, the coral cover down here is just 2%. And this should be a wake-up call for everybody around the world, because, you know, this is what's in store for most reefs around the world unless we do something about it. So what's killing these reefs? Well, us, obviously. It's a combination of local stressors and one major global stressor. So the local stressors are direct human impact, you know, direct damage from divers and snorkelers, people taking shells, and, you know, people dropping anchors. We've got a disappearance of herbivores. There was a disease event down here in the 1980s that wiped out the sea urchins. And people don't think that sea urchins are particularly special, but they're actually critical. They're really important grazers of algae that colonize that substrate. So they keep the substrate clean, which allows other corals to come and settle. So once this disease event killed most of them off, we had a phase shift from a coral-dominated environment to an algae-dominated environment. Development and pollution. There didn't used to be a sewage treatment system down here in the Keys, and so sewage was going straight from people's bathrooms onto the reef. It caused a huge outbreak of a disease called whitepox, which wiped out around 90% of the staghorn and elkhorn coral down here. And then now we know chemicals and sunscreen. So you know, we call it death by 1,000 cuts. Really, these are the local stresses, but these we can mitigate immediately. These are all things that we can do, you know, make changes in today. And then there is, you know, the big one, the global stressor of climate change. So the greenhouse gases that we're pumping into the environment are causing waters to become hot and more acidic, and this is an impossible environment for corals and other marine life to endure. And so we're seeing these, you know, increasingly regular and increasingly dramatic bleaching events. So why should we care? I mean, most of us watching care because we love them. But these ecosystems, these environments are absolutely critical for all life on Earth. You know, that only 0.2% of the ocean floor is covered by coral reefs, and yet a quarter at least of all marine life are supported by them in one way or another. Coral reefs are also really, really important, as we mentioned before, and these diagrams show, you know, exactly why. You can see in the top a healthy coral reef, the waves break offshore, you know, there are healthy fisheries, it's protecting the mangroves. Degraded coral reefs no longer perform these same functions. So let's talk about restoring these environments. You know, when we actually make an effort to do something about it and to bring them back, we are benefiting, you know, all of these other elements of our own lives, never mind, you know, the diversity in the ocean. However, the problem is enormous. And so large scale, enormous, massive action is what is required, especially down here in a place like the Keys, where the reefs are so incredibly degraded. But luckily, this is the good bit, this is the good news. This is exactly what we're doing at Coral Restoration Foundation every single day. We've got people out there in the water physically working to restore and rebuild these reefs. So I think it's common knowledge, right, that in the Chinese character for crisis contains the characters for danger, but also opportunity. So here in Florida, while we're facing a horrific destruction of the coral reefs here, it also means that we have experience. We have 13 plus years of experience here at ground zero. Coral Restoration Foundation started work in 2007. We now manage the largest coral restoration effort in the world. We've designed techniques and methods of intervention that can be used in other places. So people can actually intervene and start restoring their reefs before they get to this tipping point. We invented something called the coral tree. You can see pictures of them here, and we'll talk a little bit about that later on. We raise 45,000 corals every year in our offshore nurseries, and we're working very closely with a number of partners to restore genetic diversity, which is a critical component of the restoration of any ecosystem or population of any animal. So these interventions, these methods which we're developing and continuing to develop here are now methods that we can share with the world. So as reefs around the world start to degrade, we have the solution, we have the technologies that work, we have the data that underpins it. So how do we do it? Well, it's actually more simple than you might think. Essentially, we grow these corals through a process which we call propagation, which is a term you might be familiar with from the plant world. Basically, corals reproduce two ways, sexually and asexually. Sexually through spawning and asexually through fragmentation. So these particular species are actually designed to break off during high energy events, to roll around on the reef, find a little crevice to lodge into, and grow into a clone of the parent colony. So we take advantage of this process. So you have small pieces of coral, which we hang on the trees. They grow super fast. When they're reef ready, we take them down, we return them to the reef, and after a few years, if they've survived, they will spawn and kickstart the reef's natural process of recovery. Our focus is really on growing four main species. We focus really heavily on the staghorn and the elkhorn coral. These are fast growing. They were the dominant species down here historically, and two species of star coral, which is a bouldering species. All of these species are on the IUCN Red List of endangered species, and the staghorn and elkhorn are actually listed as critically endangered. So that's one step away from being extinct in the wild. But in the nurseries, the coral nurseries that we have, we actually have 11 species in total, and we can talk a little bit more about that in a minute. So as we said, we grow these corals through propagation. The first corals came from healthy wild colonies up and down the reef tract. They were collected all under permit from the Florida Keys National Marine Sanctuary. And our nurseries are now self-sufficient. We no longer collect anything from the wild. In fact, many of the genetic strains of coral that we have in the nurseries no longer exist in the wild. So it's quite lucky that we were actually able to go out there and get samples of these genetic material. So this is the coral tree. This is a tree that's just been hung with little fragments of coral. Each coral tree holds about 60 corals. Now what I want you to do is I want you to pick your favorite coral. I really like the one on the bottom corner. All right, are you looking at it? Very good. This is the same tree 9 months later. So you can see your coral is now really big and healthy. The corals do really, really well on these trees. These trees are amazing. They're very cheap to produce. You can grow a huge number of coral in a very, very small footprint. They're suspended in the water column. So if there's a high energy event, they don't break, they can move back and forth. In fact, almost all of our trees survived Hurricane Irma in 2017. They've also got 360-degree access to nutrients. which means that they can spend all of their energy, rather than investing in a single point of attachment on the reef, they can invest all their energy in throwing out all these fantastic branches and growing in, in all directions. When the water's really hot in the summer, we can actually pull the trees down closer to the ocean floor where it's cooler. And when it's cold in the winter, we raise them up and get them into the warmer waters above. So the corals really do incredibly well. But it's not just one coral tree that we're talking about. And it's not just a dozen trees. We're talking about entire nurseries of trees. So if you look at this picture, you can see every little black dot in that picture is a coral tree that holds 60 corals. These funny satellite looking ones, those are the trees that have been especially designed for the star corals, the bouldering corals. Because of the way they grow, they like to be sitting face up towards the surface. This is the Tavernier Nursery, and it's the world's largest coral nursery. It contains more than 500 trees. It covers 1.5 acres of seafloor, and you can grow more than 30,000 corals to a reef-ready size every year in this nursery alone. But it's not just one nursery. We have 7 of these nurseries. The others are slightly smaller, but we're capable now of raising 45,000 corals to a reef-ready size every single year. One of the most important aspects of the nursery, though, is the genetic bank. Now, you have to think about it like this. If you wanted to restore a population of tigers, you wouldn't breed thousands of tigers from the same 2 tigers. They would all be genetically compromised, right? And it's the same with corals. Our big focus at Coral Restoration Foundation is restoring genetic diversity. Ecosystems are more resilient to changes when they are diverse. So diversity within populations, diversity of species, much like some of us have greater immunity against COVID than others might do. If we were all, going to be susceptible and get a fatal dose of COVID, then COVID would destroy the whole of the human race. However, not everybody succumbs in the same way, and it's the same with corals. They're an animal after all. So a big part of our nursery is actually dedicated to a genetic bank. A little bit like the seed bank in Norway that you might be familiar with, where they're actually banking all of these seeds in case of a zombie apocalypse or something. And it's the same in the coral nurseries. We're actually banking genetic material for the time when we're ready to actually put those genetic genotypes into production and start returning those to the wild as well. So we actually work, number is actually out of date. We've got nearly 500 genotypes across 11 species in the nursery. But it doesn't stop at the nursery. At some point, these corals have got to get back to the reef. So after about 9 months, when the corals are reef ready, the corals survive better when they're larger. They do better out in the wild. We harvest them from the trees, and then it's very high tech. They're basically milk crates and buckets. We group them by genotype. We put them into crates and we transport them by a boat or a truck or something to whichever reef site we're going to be working on that day. At the reef site, our divers will basically outplant. We call it outplant, but they're essentially gluing the corals to the reef with this 2-part non-toxic marine epoxy. We group them in these clusters because when these corals that are the same genotype, when they start growing together, if they're the same, they will fuse into thickets, and that's what we want to see. We want to see these thickets of coral which create that matrix that's really important habitat for all sorts of other species. So when we group them like this in the same genotype, that's how that works, and it does work. We have a science program that is monitoring the health of the corals and the reef sites that we're working on. And the data shows that after 1 year, we have an average survivorship of around 70% across all sites and species. Now, of course, successive years, that number will go down. There is always expected mortality. When people take hatchlings, turtle hatchlings, and then release those into the ocean once they're slightly larger, nobody expects that every single one of those turtles is going to survive, but there is strength in number. It's a numbers game. So when you release 20,000 turtles, you know that at least some of those are going to survive into adulthood and to reproduce, and it's the same with the corals. So even though after a year we have 70% survivorship, that number goes down, but the more often we go back and put corals on that same reef site, that survivorship actually increases. But we're not really tracking, we're not really looking for 1 or 2 corals to survive. What we're trying to do here is restore an entire ecosystem. So going out and measuring your survivorship and counting how many corals are alive and how many are dead isn't really the kind of metric that we need to look at. So we're now using technology to create what we call photomosaics. You can see one here in this picture. Photomosaic is essentially a huge conglomerate image made up of thousands and thousands of smaller images. And it allows us to take a look at a reef and measure how much area of reef we're actually restoring. But it also gives us all sorts of other data as well. So this is our science program manager collecting a photomosaic. It's basically a DPV with 2 GoPros on a rig. She swims over the reef and they're set to take a photograph every second. And then we come back into the office. She downloads those into a computer and magically stitches them together with this incredible software. And it spits out these images. Now, this is one section of a photomosaic, and you can see these elkhorns. They're about 2 years old. You can see this elkhorn coral. So this method actually is allowing us to really understand how much reef we're restoring. But even more than that, these images can be shared with other researchers around the world who might have different questions, like what other animals are coming back? What other benthic life is being attracted to this area now that the corals are returning? And this is really critical. You know, we can't be doing this alone. We work a lot with other groups, other organizations, government agencies, universities, other researchers, collaborating on, you know, finding out answers to the questions that we need to ask. And the photomosaics are really critical in terms of those partnerships. One of the partnerships, one of our collaborations was with a scientist called Margaret Miller. Now, what I'm going to tell you might seem pretty obvious, but give me a chance. So Margaret Miller came out and she did a 10-year study looking at reefs where restoration work was taking place and comparing them with reefs where no restoration work was happening. And she found that in areas where reef restoration work was occurring, the trajectory of populations were increasing. So you'd see more corals, as you would expect. She also found that in areas where no restoration work was occurring, the populations continued to decline. Now, this sounds obvious, but it has 2 really important implications. The first one is that without restoration efforts, these reefs would be gone. The second important implication is that even though there is some expected mortality, this works. It's keeping coral populations out there in the wild. And these corals are doing well. They're not just surviving, they're thriving. This is a staghorn thicket. So this is, I would say, 3 to 4 years after being outplanted. You can see these staghorn. This was once 10 colonies, 10 little staghorn corals, which have grown together now and fused into this thicket. But even more exciting than that, as little as 2 years after being outplanted, we're seeing our corals spawning. Now, spawning is the sexual reproduction of corals. And much like people, corals will only reproduce sexually when they have enough energy to do so. So the fact that they're spawning out in the wild means that they're really, really healthy. Spawning is absolutely critical for creating new genotypes, new genetic diversity. So remember, the corals that we're outplanting are clones of their parents. We're returning at least 50 different genotypes of staghorn and 50 different genotypes of elkhorn to every single reef site that we're working on. So when these corals spawn, they're going to be creating new genotypes that are the result of the crossing of some of the genotypes that we've put out there. Now, the fact that the corals are spawning, the fact that they're thriving, could also be due to the fact that the corals we work with have survived 40 years of stressors. So it means that they're likely to be pretty hardy already. And so as they spawn, hopefully their progeny are going to be even more well adapted to withstand the stresses of climate change and other human impacts. But what's also cool about this is we know exactly when our corals will spawn. And because every single coral that's come through the nursery has been genetically sequenced, we know exactly what DNA every single coral has. This means that we can invite researchers and restoration practitioners and scientists from around the world to come down. It's normally it's the full moon after the summer solstice, so it's normally around July or August. And every single year we'll be descended upon by scientists and researchers who will come out into the nurseries and actually use the unique infrastructure that Coral Restoration Foundation provides to enable them to collect gametes. Gametes are the eggs and the sperm of the coral, for things like cryopreservation, to keep that genetic material intact, for reproduction, for research, for crossing of different genotypes. So having this resource for them is really, really important. In fact, in 2018, Florida Aquarium led a group that came down and collected coral spawn from the nursery. They took the spawn back to the aquariums and created more than 3,000 brand new genotypes. They reared them in their aquaria for about 9 months, and then brought the new coral babies back to the nursery where they became acclimated to the open ocean. And then those brand new genotypes were actually outplanted back on the reef late last year. So the reefs of Florida have now genotypes that they've never had out there before, and hopefully those are even hardier than the parent corals that created them. So we started off pretty depressing with Carysfort Reef, but these days Carysfort Reef is starting to look a little bit better. So this is a baby elkhorn cluster, about a year old after it's been outplanted. Here are those same clusters around 2 years later. So you can see, yes, a lot of the reef is still pretty barren, but you can see this new growth, that bright yellow tissue, and it's growing, it's thriving, it's starting to skirt over the reef and reclaim that territory. We've now returned more than 120,000 corals to the wild since 2007. We've restored, in 2019 alone, we actually returned more than 32,000 corals to the reef. And in total, we've restored an area about 8,000 square meters, which is larger than an American football field. In this picture, you can see, how well these corals are doing. Those are 2017, 9 months, and then 2 years later, you can see how well they're growing. But the thing is, if we're going to win this fight to save our coral reefs, then it's more than just CRF out there planting coral. We need to work together. So in 2017, NOAA, the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration here in the States, CRF, co-founded something called the Coral Restoration Consortium. And the idea is there are thousands and thousands of people out there around the world working on this very issue. We don't have time for us to be siloed, for us not to be talking to each other. So the Coral Restoration Consortium was created to help people collaborate, to scale up efforts to restore these reefs. We held the world's first symposium dedicated to reef restoration in 2018, and it brought together more than 500 practitioners from around the world. And despite the fact that, the prognosis for coral reefs is pretty grim, the atmosphere it was called Reef Futures. The atmosphere at Reef Futures was incredibly optimistic. It was the first time that people working in this field had actually come together to really share experiences, share lessons learned, and really start working together to confront this issue head on. And so where do we go from here? Well, basically we do more. Research has shown that repeated waves of outplanting at the same reef sites increases survivorship. So, and I'm making these numbers up, but essentially if you go out onto a brand new reef site, you plant 100 corals and you leave them, you might only get 20% surviving after 5 or 10 years. But if you go back onto that same reef and then you plant another 100 corals, you might get around 60% of them surviving. And then if you go back and you plant a third time, many, many more, 80% or above of those corals will actually survive. Scientists don't really understand exactly why this is yet, but it basically indicates that we just need to keep putting corals back on the reef. The success of the efforts that we've had down here in Florida has led to an unprecedented collaboration between NOAA, Coral Restoration Foundation, Mote Marine Laboratories, Florida Aquarium, University of Florida, and other partners, where we launched in 2019 an effort, a mission called Mission Iconic Reefs. And this is going to be the world's largest restoration effort. It's anticipated that we'll be able to restore 93,000 square meters of reef on 7 iconic reef sites down here in the Florida Keys. It's a phased approach, a phased plan, and it'll be about a 20-year time frame. But this is the first time that we're actually going to be able to say, you know, within our generation, we will be able to turn the tide. We will be able to make a difference for our coral reefs. And we really need to do that. Humanity has never before faced the extinction of an entire biome. We don't know what the severity of the consequences of this will be for humanity and for all life on Earth. We can't do this alone. We need everybody. Your choices matter. The choices that you make every day impact the world around us. It's up to each of us to choose our change. We don't need everybody doing everything perfectly. We need millions of people doing something imperfectly. We need everybody to find the cause that speaks to them. It might be coral reefs, it might not, it might be something else, it might be planting trees. It's all important. All ecosystems are interconnected. So if there's one thing that I would urge you is find a cause that speaks to you, find an environmental mission in your local area and make a difference, because that will make a difference for the coral reefs. I'm going to show you a little video that might hopefully inspire you to choose your change. So if you found that inspiring, then we'd really encourage you to get involved. Now, normally for World Oceans Day, Coral Restoration Foundation throws a huge celebration, which we call Coral Palooza. Coral Palooza is the world's largest day of reef restoration. Normally, we invite hundreds of divers down to Florida. In 2019, we actually returned 1,700 corals to the reefs here in just one day. And we do this every World Oceans Day. But of course, this year, things are a little bit different. So this year, Coral Restoration Foundation took Coral Palooza digital. Now, Coral Palooza digital is it's the first time we've ever done it. And the idea was to gather all sorts of incredible, inspiring, hopeful messages around coral restoration work that's going on around the world. So the platform is actually open until August the 25th. It's completely free. It is not a fundraising effort. It's basically to share hope, to spread hope, to raise awareness about the issues facing coral reefs around the world, and to show everybody that hope exists. There are hundreds and hundreds of people around the world right now working to restore these incredible ecosystems. So if you'd like to find out more, head over to Coral Palooza Digital 2020, and yeah, dive in. Kids Zone. We've got booths from organizations from around the world. There's interactive content, videos, downloads, all sorts of things. It's a great place to start if any of this presentation has inspired you to get involved with helping to save coral reefs. So that's it. Thank you so much. And thank you again, John and team and all of you wonderful people at Underwater 360 for hosting this and for letting me go on and on about the coral reefs. Nora, do we have any questions?
Hi, Alice.
Hi, Nora.
Hi, Alice. Thank you for your presentation. Well, we do have some questions on Facebook. But before we go there, I have a personal question. How is it that and as a senior editor and a journalist jump into being a coral conservationist?
That's a very good question, but I think John Tett and the rest of the team will tell you that even when I was there working as a senior editor, marine conservation has always been my passion. It's kind of the family business. When I was very small, I spent most of my childhood in Saudi Arabia, snorkeling on the reefs of the Red Sea. I've been diving since I was a young teenager, and for me, coral reefs are it's a part of my family. I can't explain to you how it's a deeply personal mission for me. You know, this has been, my father was an environmental conservationist, my mother's a teacher. And yeah, these ecosystems, the coral reef ecosystem, for me, it's personal. It's really personal.
Okay, we have a question. You know, you being someone who is very much in love with the ocean, and you do care about the condition that goes underwater, especially marine biodiversity, may it be corals, may it be marine life. You know, as you have shown with us to us just now, like what are the effects that you've seen that has been you know, looking really downwards over the past years based on human actions. So how do you actually stay positive in witnessing all this? And does that actually drive you to want to work even harder to make it, you know, like flourishing and beautiful as it was when you first experienced it?
That's a really good question. Sometimes it's hard to remain positive, Nora, honestly. But one of the reasons I love working with Coral Restoration Foundation is because it is so hopeful. I've seen with my own eyes, I've returned corals to the reef with my own hands, and I've seen with my own eyes corals that are out there that have been there for 5, 6, 7, 10 years. And I see that it works. I see that hope exists, that it is possible. But you know something, Nora, even if I wasn't working with Coral Restoration Foundation and I didn't have the opportunity every day to see that hope, I would still fight for it, because not on my watch, you know, not on my watch. On my watch, I'm going to do everything I possibly can to not lose these incredibly precious ecosystems and species.
You know, I guess like when you're younger, especially when you're diving and it was your first time diving and seeing a whole new world altogether, um, how would you actually uh, advice to the youth of the new generation, the next generation basically, to how they can actually experience this, and also if they do experience this and they feel inspired, how could they actually use their voice to amplify the cause even further?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think the first message to the coming generations has to be an apology, you know, for the world that we're handing off to them. They really are the hope, though. I would say that, you know, young people, young people, I think, care more about this than many of the older generation, because they know that this is the world that they're going to live in. And I think young people need to vote. They need to vote for supporting legislation that helps protect the environment. They need to talk to their parents, to their friends. You know, if they care about something, they need to make a noise about it. And much like you know, Bertie was saying before, to just learn, to educate yourself about the issues, about the possibilities that are out there. You know, education is the greatest weapon that we have in the fight to save our natural world.
Thanks, Alice. Just a quick one. I'm sure you have a personality which really inspire you a lot since you're young or even till now. Is there one person that has been the key driver in your life in pursuing what is it that you do right now?
Yeah, I feel quite emotional when you ask me that question. Yeah, my dad, actually. It's my father. He's worked in conservation his whole career, in terrestrial biodiversity and protected area management, mostly in the Middle East. And yeah, I'm sorry, I feel quite emotional thinking about it. Yeah, he has been the greatest inspiration, I think, in terms of what I do for a living. You know, I spent my childhood with him in the desert in Saudi Arabia, wandering around collecting scorpions in jars and snakes and things like that. So, you know, he exposed me to the world of natural history and the wonder of our natural world from, you know, before I can even remember. And so I've been so blessed to have him in my life and to really, you know, show me the beauty of our planet and give me the motivation to fight to save it.
Thank you, Alice. And I really feel your I don't know. I guess I feel how you're feeling right now, and your dad must have been a very inspiring individual, and giving you the encouragement to actually pursue what you're doing right now, especially what you are doing at the moment, which is pretty inspiring on its own. Thank you so much for your time and staying up all the way just to attend this talk with us, and also to share with the edX community about your love for the oceans, and how is it to be a true ocean citizen at heart. So like what John Ted always say, one ocean, one love. So thank you once again. We look forward to see you soon. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nora, and thank you, Underwater 360 and the ADEX team. Thank you. Happy World Oceans Day.